Studies in John's Gospel by Rita Holtman-Finger, and it has the reading split up into sections as scenes in a play, and then there will be commentary on that particular section. It's called Who is Blind and Who Can See? A one-act comedy in 6 scenes.
And I'm your narrator. Once upon a time, a man born blind received his sight. But as we see throughout this gospel, an act of healing is never simply a miracle where the recipient goes off and lives happily ever after. It becomes a sign pointing to a deeper truth. In this case, the sign weaves through such a thicket of ironies and misunderstandings that it rivals some of Shakespeare's comedies. The antagonists work hard to prove that white is black and black is white and even the new white is black, making this chapter the most hilarious in the whole New Testament. As you read it, ponder these questions. Who is blind and who can see? Who is a sinner and who is righteous? Who is an insider and who is an outsider? Who knows where Jesus comes from and who knows nothing?
Scene 1. Chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. Later, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. "Master, whose sin caused this man's blindness?" asked the disciples. "His own or his parents'?" "He was not born blind because of his own sin or that of his parents," returned Jesus, "but to show the power of God at work in him. We must carry on the work of him who sent me while the daylight lasts. Night is coming when no one can work. I am the world's light as long as I am in it." Having said this, he spat on the ground and made a sort of clay with the saliva. This he applied to the man's eyes and said, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means one who has been sent. So the man went off and washed and came home with his sight restored.
Sukkot, the festival of water and light, has now ended, but Jesus remains in Jerusalem. One Sabbath, as he and his disciples walk down the street, they encounter a common sight, a disabled beggar, whom we shall call Jacob. The text does not say how they knew Jacob had been born blind, but the disciples ask a question typical for their culture. Who sinned, this man or his parents? Refusing to link sin and disability, Jesus says neither, but they have encountered Jacob so that God's works might be revealed in him, repeating, "I am the light of the world." Jesus falls to his knees in the dirt, spits on it to make mud, and plasters it on the man's eyes. "Go wash this off in the pool of Siloam," he commands. With nothing to lose, Jacob complies. The scales on his eyes fall off, and now he can see. It's a huge adjustment. But for the next 27 verses, Jesus is absent, and Jacob is on his own.
Scene 2. Verses 8 to 12. His neighbours and the people who had often seen him before as a beggar remarked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" "Yes, that's the one," said some. Others said, "No, but he's very like him." But he himself said, "I'm the man, all right." "Then how was your blindness cured?" they asked. "The man called Jesus made some clay and smeared it on my eyes," he replied. "And then he said, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So off I went and washed. And that's how I got my sight." "Where is he now?" they asked. "I don't know," he returned.
Is this Jacob or isn't it? On the street where everybody knows everybody else's business, the neighbours can't agree. "Yes, it's me," says Jacob. "And now I can see because some man came along and put mud in my eyes and told me to wash it off in the pool. Who was this man? How should I know? I never saw the guy."
Scene 3, verses 13 to 17. Some of the Pharisees commented, "This man cannot be from God since he does not observe the Sabbath. But how can a sinner give such wonderful signs as these?" Others demurred, and they were in two minds about him. Finally, they asked the blind man again, "And what do you say about him? You're the one whose sight was restored." "I believe he is a prophet," he replied.
The neighbours bring Jacob to their religious leaders to figure this out. But when Jacob tells how he was healed, the Pharisees argue over whether or not the healer sinned. Jacob is unequivocal. He is a prophet.
Scene 4, verses 18 to 23. The Jewish leaders did not really believe that the man had been blind and then had been able to see until they had summoned his parents and asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How does it happen that he can now see?" "We know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind," returned his parents. "But how he can see now, or who made him able to see, we have no idea. Why don't you ask him? He's a grown-up man. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, who had already agreed that anyone who admitted that Christ had done this thing should be excommunicated. It was this fear that made his parents say, "Ask him. He is a grown-up man."
As in previous Johannine episodes, this is a court trial. The charge is working on the Sabbath. The judges are the Pharisees. The accused is the absent healer. And the witnesses are Jacob and the neighbours. First, the judges haul in Jacob's parents, who clearly don't want to be involved. Yes, he is their son, but they won't comment further. They clearly are hiding what they know.
Scene 5, verses 24 to 34. So once again they summoned the man who had been born blind and said to him, "You should give God the glory for what has happened to you. We know that this man is a sinner. Whether he is a sinner or not, I couldn't tell. But one thing I am sure of," the man replied. "I used to be blind, now I can see." "But what did he do to you? How did he make you see?" they continued. "I've told you before," he replied. "Weren't you listening? Why do you want to hear it all over again? Are you wanting to be his disciples too?" At this they turned on him furiously. "You're the one who is his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this man, we don't even know where he came from." "Now here's the extraordinary thing," he retorted. "You don't know where he came from, and yet he gave me this gift of sight. Everybody knows that God does not listen to sinners. It is the man who has a proper respect for God and does what God wants him to do. He's the one who God listens to. Why, since the world began, nobody's ever heard of a man who was born blind being given his sight. If this man did not come from God, he couldn't do such a thing. You misbegotten wretch," they flung at him. "Are you trying to teach us?" And they threw him out.
But these timid parents have a son who, though previously a lowly beggar, he is now transformed into a cocky, self-possessed debater. He mocks his superiors for their ignorance and defends the unknown healer as one who, without any doubt, has come from God. As you read, chuckle over this outrageous David and Goliath dialogue. Alas, the Pharisees have the last word. They throw him out of the synagogue, isolating him from the centre of social and religious life in his community. As a blind beggar, he probably already was marginal. But now his big mouth has robbed him of any chance of becoming a respectable member of his larger kin group in the local synagogue.
Scene 6, verses 35 to 41. Jesus heard that they had expelled him, and when he had found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "And who is he, sir?" the man replied. "Tell me so I can believe in him." "You have seen him," replied Jesus. "It is the one who is talking to you now." "Lord, I do believe," he said, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said, "My coming into this world is itself a judgment. Those who cannot see have their eyes opened, and those who think they can see become blind." Some of the Pharisees nearby overheard him and said, "So we're blind too, are we?" "If you were blind," returned Jesus, "nobody could blame you. But as you can insist, we can see your guilt remains."
Encounter, conversion, and more ironic riddles. At last, Jesus arrives on the scene and finds the shunned Jacob. He asks the odd question, "Do you believe in the human one?" "Who is he, sir? Tell me so I may believe in him." "You have seen him, and the one speaking to you is he." And Jacob kneels down and worships Jesus. From a position of knowing nothing, Jacob has come to an unswerving belief that his healer is from God. Standing his ground on the truth of his experience has paid off. Jesus' welcoming response to Jacob shows that the roles in the original court have shifted. Now Jesus is the judge. "I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." But he said this loudly enough so some nearby Pharisees asked him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" "No," says Jesus, in a further ironic twist. "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now you say, 'We see,' your sin remains."
I'd like to introduce you to someone that's not very well known in this community, Mr. Bruce End. I've asked Bruce to share something of his story about being a person who is differently abled.
Thank you, David. Now, those of you who have followed Pause for Thought for any length of time at all will know that I can be a pretty difficult so-and-so. If you want confirmation of that, just ask Anne what kind of a bugger I can be sometimes. I can get very frustrated because of my blindness. But I need to say that through the love and care that I receive from Anne and my family, and you, this community, it makes it possible for me to cope with my blindness most of the time. It's really difficult when you used to be able to do something and you can't do it anymore. But hey, listen, you don't have to look very far to find somebody who's worse off than you. For 15 years, I have had an extension on from my hand. First it was Keely and now it's Wallace. Independence is important to me and to all people. And to be able to know that I'm reasonably safe most of the time is really something that's important to me, but also, fortunately, to Anne and the rest of my family. I really appreciate the love, care and concern that I receive from this community and my other friends. And I, as a person who participated in the last assembly and voted for or accepted the proposal on disability, I was really proud. I was proud of the fact that I have never felt any sort of sense of patronism within this community. It's very easy when you don't understand a person who's disabled to actually assume certain things. And I've never felt that. There are some people who probably, because I know the way around here, some people I'm sure will say from time to time, is he really blind? But I can tell you, you just have to be present when I do stupid things like break a mug in the kitchen. And anyway. Look, I am really pleased to be a member of this community and to know that regardless of my foibles and my deficiencies, both personality and physical in my blindness, I'm accepted and valued as a member of the community, just as everybody is. We all have different things that we can do, and some of us have more obvious disabilities than others. And within this community of hospitality and welcome, fortunately, I've never felt that. And I hope that nobody who comes through those doors will ever feel it either. Thank you very much for your part in my life and your part in the lives of so many other people. Thank you very much to Anne and my family. And I really, as I say, acknowledge the work that Guide Dogs does to provide assistance for people who are blind or vision impaired. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. When Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in his first year at seminary, he marvelled at the story of the way Jesus behaved with children. He noted that he took them in his arms and blessed them. And from that moment, he saw that the kingdom that Jesus was instituting was a kingdom of children, a kingdom of nobodies. That stuck with him, and as you see the work and the life of Martin Luther King, he worked tirelessly for those who were nobodies. And indeed, we see Jesus amongst the nobodies. We see him with those who were rejected by the society of the time. Where do we see Jesus mostly? He's with the tax collectors, the sinners, a Samaritan woman. Jews hated the Samaritans. That's where we find Jesus. And on this Sunday, it's actually traditionally the last Sunday of the Christian year in which we celebrate Christ the King Sunday. And Christ the King was crucified between two criminals. He's still amongst those who were on the edge or on the outside. Now, the Gospel according to John, as we heard that fairly short reading today, that Gospel really does highlight that darkness comes into the world to try and dispel the light, to overcome the light. But the Gospel starts off with the light was coming into the world and the darkness was not able to overcome it. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." And this story, this long story, this saga of this blind beggar is testimony to the way Jesus looked upon those who were differently abled. Now, I use that term. In 1991, Judith and I went to the World Council of Churches in Canberra, and that was the phrase that was used, not disabled, but differently abled. And as I'm privileged to stand here and see so many people differently abled, I cannot play the piano. I cannot play well, I was going to say I do sort of hum and strum the guitar, but I cannot play it like Craig, and so on and so forth. And we see Jesus amidst the people who were differently abled, who were rejected. And we see that he looked upon them without judgment except the judgment of love. Now, I want to tell you a story about Dr. Gutmann. Dr. Gutmann was a German Jew who was brought to England towards the end of the Second World War. He was a doctor, and he was sent to Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Buckinghamshire, and there he was to look after paraplegic officers, soldiers who had been injured in the war, and the regime of the time simply kept them in bed, covered over, where they developed bed sores, and really they were waiting just for them to die. They were just looking after them for that time. And Gutmann looked at them and said, that's not the way that we should be doing it. And of course he ran foul of the doctors of the time, and the nurses. They thought they were doing the right thing, but he insisted that they got them out of their beds, out into the fresh air. And then he hit upon the idea that it might be good for them if they actually did some sort of sport. And so he got them to play hockey on their wheelchairs and basketball. And some of them were able to go to the local pub and do arm wrestling. It was a wonderful move by Dr. Gutmann. There was a movie made of that whole process called The Best of Men. It was released in 2012, and if you ever get a chance to see it, it's really worth seeing. The best of men. He brought out of them the ability to live again. Thus started the Stoke Mandeville Games, which then became the Handicap Games, which now has become the Paralympics. All because of Dr. Gutmann, who saw the best in these men and not the worst. And isn't that the story we had today? That Jesus saw not a sinner, but one loved, one precious. I said in the order of service that this would be a brief sermon. Well, here's the end. Some of you know about Carnegie Hall in New York. Carnegie Hall is the pinnacle of one's performance. I know there's a member of this congregation who's been there a number of times and played the piano. I'm not mentioning names, but anyway, so to get to Carnegie Hall is a great achievement. And the question was asked, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. And my dear friends, how do we put into play the love for all people and make this a house where all are welcome, all of different abilities, all who are differently abled? Practice, practice, practice. Amen.